believer. This morning we're going to be speaking about household care. How do we relate to each other in God's church? The pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are written to two pastors, you know this by now, Timothy and Titus, that are serving two different churches in two different locations. But the counsel and the guidance that God gives to them through the hand of Paul is important to any church in any situation. 1 Timothy 5, verses 1 through 8 are going to deal with two very important issues that I believe any and every church is going to face in its lifetime. The first issue deals with how we relate to fellow members of God's church. The second deals with the proper care of widows. Now, Paul's going to expand on that second category, and we'll look at that in a couple of weeks. Before we begin, it's important to point out that the way that we relate to each other in the church is vital for the spiritual health of our church. You see, this is Christ's church, Christ's bride. What that means is that the church is not mine. The church is not yours. We are a part of God's church, but we don't own it. Christ does. He sets the rules for his church, and I believe that we would do well to follow the rules that Christ has established. Every household has a certain set of ground rules. Parents, you know this. Grandparents, you know this. You especially know this in the car. Have any of you been driving down the road with either your children, maybe they were a bit younger, or today maybe it's grandchildren, they're all riding in the back seat, you know, all 3 or 4 or 5 or however many that you have, they're crammed in there. And what happens when children are crammed next to each other? You know. The conversation from mom and dad turns from, well, did you look at the weather today, honey, to, hey, quit pulling on her hair, you know, and get your fingernails out of his arm. There are rules in every house. Rules are set in place to maintain peace and to maintain harmony. We need a good set of rules. Why? Because we are fallen people that are in need of God's grace. Paul's charge to Timothy, I would argue, is equally a charge to us. And I'm going to repeat it a couple of times. If I could summarize verses 1 through 8, the summary would sound like this. Encourage and support fellow members of God's house. That's our thesis today. Encourage each other. Support each other. Why? Because this is God's house. We're going to look at two things today. We're going to look first at verses 1 through 2. Paul speaks of the treatment of men and women. And then secondly, we'll look at verses 3 through 8, Paul's treatment toward widows. Now, you'll probably notice with me in verses 1 and 2, I want to read them again and just see if anything jumps out. In light of our current culture, let's listen to these words. Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. Now, I've got to tell you that normally I would read through a couple of verses like that, and I wouldn't even blink an eye at the categories that Paul is using. Older man, older woman, younger man, younger woman. Just kind of course, that's the way it is. Men and women. But you see, in our culture today, there's a lot of confusion about that, isn't there? I learned this week that some sort of actress out there wants to be called they. And I'm thinking, is there more than one of you? And apparently there is, because she's very confused about herself, you know? So all these identities are swirling around, and it's a proverbial they. Well, Paul doesn't, and the Bible doesn't, communicate like that. It communicates about the way that God made us And so in verses 1 and 2, Paul's speaking about, again, men and women. Binary categories that our culture is very confused about. That's a whole nother sermon. I'll save it for later. Let's look closely at verse 1. Paul speaks about two categories of men: older men and younger men. Now we have to remember that Timothy is a young man. Many of the men that he's going to be interacting with in the church that he's at are older than him. And in that situation, I would say many pastors, myself included, find ourselves in churches where there are a lot of men that are older than we are. How do we respond? How do we relate to older men? Well, there are general rules of decorum and humility that states that older men should be treated with respect and dignity. Paul tells Timothy, don't rebuke an older man harshly. The term rebuke in Greek could also be translated strike at. Don't strike at an older man. Paul is speaking of exhortation. When you exhort, you build up. When you strike at, metaphorically, we won't go literally, but metaphorically, when you strike at someone, your intention is to tear them down. The truth is that all of us will need correction from time to time. That's just the way it is. Why? Because none of us are perfect yet. But there's a proper way to exhort. There's a proper way to correct. Timothy is to treat every older man as he would his own father. Now, if you're like me, you've probably noticed that sometimes older people are wrong. Hang on. Put your stones away. So last week, my boss, my 15-year-old son, signed me up for a landscaping job. He said, Dad, I've got it all covered. I've made all the calculations. All I need you to do is show up and work. We get to the yard that he has bid this flower bed on, and I begin to look at things and scrutinize it. I was kind of in a grumpy mood. I didn't want to be a slave that day. Really wanted a day off. But I began to walk past the flower bed. We were going to put in some new metal edging, and I did the rough calculation. You take your own foot. It's about a foot, so you can pace it off. And I asked my son, well, how many pieces of metal did you order? And he gives me an answer. I said, you're off by one. His response was this: let's just put down what we have and see how far it goes. He had ordered enough. I was wrong. Older people can be wrong from time to time. We're not perfect. However, the way that we correct an error is really important. The writer of Proverbs put it like this: a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. When we treat older men as fathers, we're honoring the fifth commandment. Paul's going to come back to this command as well in relationship to women. The fifth commandment is this: honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Exodus 20 in verse 12. You see, Paul's not unique in his command to honor older men. Peter as well speaks of this in 1 Peter 5, verse 5. It says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. And he gives a reason. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So Paul has addressed the way that we approach older men. Next, he deals with the way that we approach younger men, or we could say the way that we approach our peers. Younger men should be treated as fellow brothers. Now, let me ask you, do you have any brothers? How do you treat your own brothers. It's kind of long-standing rules that apply. We all know these. I was one of three, had two older brothers. The rule of the house was they could pick on me however they wanted, razz me, whatever. But if one of the other brothers was picked on by somebody else, that's out of bounds. Were those your rules as well? What do you do when your brother's picked on? You come to their aid. You defend them. Sometimes you get in a fight to protect your brother. Why? Because you love them. They're your own flesh and blood. Paul is looking at the church and he says, look around you, gentlemen. The brothers that are here, they are your spiritual flesh and blood. Protect them. Care for them. Paul next turns to two groups of women. He's spoken about older men, younger men. Now he speaks about older women and younger women. Paul speaks about the way that pastors, and by inference, I would argue, all men should treat women. Greek sentence here in verse 2 is a little odd. There's no verb. Now, in English, you can't speak this way. You can't write this way. Otherwise, you'll get graded off on papers or corrected by your mother. But in Greek, you can communicate without using a verb. Literally, the second verse reads like this: older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. Paul's still talking about the church as God's house. And he's talking about the way that we interact with each other as a member of the household of God. So how do we relate, gentlemen, to the ladies of this church? The answer is we care for them, we love them as we would our own mother or our own sister. Now I know Mother's Day has come and gone. You're probably thinking at this point, you should have preached this sermon a couple weeks back, but better late than never. Sometimes familiarity with another person can breed contempt. What picture of a mother do you have in your own mind? You know, one of my favorite TV ads, I don't watch TV much, so this is a really old one, is that Geico ad of the secret agent who's fighting on the rooftop. The helicopters are coming in. You've probably seen that one. And he's in the middle of like mid-punch or kick, and all of a sudden his cell phone rings. And he takes his cell phone, and it's his mom. And his mom just goes in right into the conversation to talk about squirrels. The squirrels are back, you know, and they're tormenting your father, and he's out, and she's just talking on and on and on. And the secret agent answers back, Mom, can you give me a minute? I'll call you back. Now, the point of the ad went like this, you know, moms always call at the wrong time, but I like to take that a little differently. The guy actually answered his phone when his schedule did not permit it. The point is that I think it's relatively easy to honor your mom, to treat your mom with dignity and respect when it fits on your timetable. But when it doesn't fit on your timetable, then the story is completely different. We should honor our mothers, nurture our mothers. We know this. The same is true for the women in the church in general. You see, Paul is picturing the church again as a family. And you could look around. You know, men look around, women look around. What do you see next to you? You see spiritual mothers, spiritual fathers, spiritual siblings, brothers and sisters. We should honor our family, love our family. Next, Paul talks about younger women. To those who are close to the same age or younger than we are, we treat them as sisters. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that we reach over and grab the sister's hair next to us because that's what we did in the car as a kid? No. It means that we look out for our sisters, that we honor them, that we protect them. Notice as well that the verse ends, treat them in all purity. This is a sexual term. Treat younger women as sisters. It deals with the respect and care for them. It deals with their sexual and moral purity as well. Gentlemen, if you look around you, you're surrounded by spiritual mothers and spiritual sisters. Treat them with purity. Treat them with dignity, respect. They're your mothers and sisters. They are not an object to fantasize about. As a general rule, it's wise for a young man, and I think this applies to all of the men in the church, not just young or old, but all men, never to be alone with a woman who is close to your own age or younger than you. Mike Pence has his Pence rule. It became famous. Pastor that I like a lot, Philip Ryken, has his own rule. We'll call it the Ryken rule. I like his a little better than Pence's. Philip Ryken says this, my own rule of thumb is in keeping with this verse. I will not meet alone with any woman unless she is my wife, my sister, my daughter, and then catch the last one, or old enough to be my mother. What is he saying? He's saying that you need to treat gentlemen, the women, with respect and dignity. Honor them. Every once in a while, I'll get a call from a friend who lives in Amarillo. Very intelligent man, but he calls me about household advice. Typically, it's a particular appliance that breaks that I know how to fix. And he'll call me up and say, hey, man, can you come over and fix, X appliance again? It's acting up. And I usually respond by saying this, yeah, man, absolutely. But let me ask you a question. So, yeah, go ahead. Are you going to be there? Because, see, one time he said, hey, just head on over. My wife's there. She'll let you in. And I had to say, whoa, time out. You got to understand something. I would love to fix your appliance. But I'm not going to go to your house when you're not there. Why? Because I'm your friend. And as your friend, I honor you. I honor your relationship with your wife. I'm not going to put myself or you in a situation that is dishonorable. And you wouldn't want me to do that either. You know what my buddy said when I explained this to him? He goes, gosh, yeah, that really makes sense. I'll call a repairman instead. Now, point is, gentlemen, we've got to be deliberate about the way that we treat the opposite sex. Women, be deliberate about the way that you treat the opposite sex as well. This is God's house. God has made ground rules for his house. Uphold those rules. We now turn in verses 3 through 8 to the treatment of widows. I want to read our scripture again so that it's back in our memory as we look at this passage. Verse 3 begins, honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. For this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Often life does not work out the way that we think it will. You see, we tend to create in our minds this image of marriage and relationship fashioned off of the Hallmark Channel. What is the Hallmark Channel's version of The perfect relationship, what goes something like this. Every man and woman has their perfect match out there that is the most suitable for them, and somehow they find each other. And they live a very long and happy life together, and they die holding each other's hands before they're shipped off to the nursing home, right? Hallmark reality. That's not the way life typically works. We know that. Last week I ran into a friend. She's 40 years old. She's a widow. She was married to a good friend of mine from high school and the college years. They are both friends. They began to date in college. They got married in college, began having kids, 4 kids. My friend died tragically about 3 years back. Never in this woman's mind would it have occurred to her that she would be raising by herself 4 kids without her husband. In the ancient world, that scenario was all too common. You see, many times older men would marry younger women. Their wives would inevitably outlive them, and they would find themselves in places of great need. You see, typically, women in those days were not the heir of their husband's will. They would depend on their dowry. A dowry is a sum of money or assets that you bring into the marriage relationship when you get married. If the dowry was sizable, you would be taken care of very well. If it was not sizable, then you're in a desperate situation. Most of the time, those dowries were not sizable. If a widow did not have financial resources, she had a backup plan. The backup plan was a son or grandson. If she didn't have a living son or grandson, this creates a real problem. It's a general biblical rule that God looks after those who are truly needy. He cares for widows. He cares for orphans. They have a special place in the heart of God. James 1, verse 27. There's continuity here in the heart of God between what the New Testament says about this and what the Old Testament says. Exodus 22, verses 22 through 24 reads this. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. What is God saying here? I take very seriously the care of widows and orphans. Not only does God take it seriously, but he hardwired a system among his people to look out for widows and for orphans. Verse 4 gives us a clue as to the nature of this system. If a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. We've already mentioned the 5th commandment, honor your father and mother. We could say Paul is alluding to it again in verse 4. What does the term honor bring up? Paul is not saying, hey, you should go bow down to your mom and dad. Or bow down to your mom. No. Honor is financial in nature. It also deals with respect and dignity. A woman who has a Christian family is never alone. You see, God has created the family in order to take care of its own. Now, I know there are some that don't have a broader family, children and grandchildren, but guess what? God's also placed you in this church, which is your family, to take care of you. Taking care of our parents is a matter of repayment Do you see Paul referencing that? Think about everything that you do to raise children. Parents. When they're young, they wake up at all times of the night. They cry out constantly for either food or change my diaper or I need a nap or take me to the doctor. And we do all those things. And it's a tiring, thankless job. One day, the role will be reversed. And we will be the ones who are taking care of our parents, sometimes doing the very same things, taking them to the doctor, checking in on them continually. Our culture has become all too familiar with farming out responsibility, hasn't it? Christian, take care of your folks. Take care of the widows in our community. We don't farm that off to somebody else. We own that responsibility because we love our family. Now, I know that there are situations in which specialty care is desperately needed, and I'm not speaking to that situation necessarily. But the general rule of thumb is take care of your parents. Take care of the godly widows in our midst that need special care. Verse 3 and 5, Paul speaks about widows who are truly in need. And he again uses the term honor. This is a monetary term in Paul's world. It speaks about taking care of the physical needs that our widows have. You see, some widows find themselves in situations where they have no family and they have no finances. In our culture, many women as well have been abandoned by a man. This situation creates great opportunity for the church to love and care for its own. I want to analyze now why Paul speaks of these widows as truly being widows in need. Let's take a look at verse 5. She who is truly a widow. Now what this means, if there's a group that are truly widows, then that also means that there's a group that are not truly widows in need. But let's keep reading. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues the supplications and prayers night and day. Take a look at the verb has set. You see, a true widow is a godly widow. The verb here, has set her hope on God, is called a perfect tense verb. It deals with a past action. She's a believer. She hopes in God. She's made that commitment with a continuing force in the present. That's the nature of a perfect verb in Greek. Notice that this perfect verb gives way to a present continual. What does this woman who is a believer, what does she do? What is she known for? Here we go. She continues in supplications and prayers night and day. You see, a widow who's truly a widow in need is a believer who loves the Lord her God. I believe that it's part of the church's mission generally to do good. Acts 10, verse 38. Nevertheless, our greatest ministry will be to our family, our Christian family. There's countless millions today who need a warm meal and a dry bed. That is true. Based on parables like the Good Samaritan, we generally desire to help those in need. At the same time, family must come first. Verses 3 and 5, Paul is describing a widow who's very well known for her godliness. And for this situation, Paul says, church, you bend over backwards. You do everything you can to help widows like this. Now, I said that the idea that there's a widow in need also infers that there's a widow who is not in need. Paul speaks of this in verse 6. But she who is self-indulgent is dead, even while she lives. So not all widows are worthy of honor. One of my favorite lines in J.R.R. Tolkien's books, The Lord of the Rings, from book 1, is a poem that a wizard gives to a hobbit that helps him to figure out who's truly a friend and who's truly an enemy. The poem goes like this: all that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes of fire shall be woken, a light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be the blade that was broken, the crownless again shall be king. Now the poem was given in order to help Frodo discern a friend from an enemy. The poem deals basically with this: not everybody with a rough facade is a dangerous person. Frodo found his greatest ally and his best friend in a pub called the Prancing Pony. He found him there, but this friend was amidst a bunch of different characters who looked rough and who looked gruff. And out of all of these guys, who was going to be the one to help Frodo? In other words, the poem means you've got to be discerning. Paul speaks about spiritual discernment here. Not all widows are widows in need. It takes a level of discernment to realize that. Verse 6 speaks about a woman who is, by Paul's words, self-indulgent, who lives for pleasure. When we speak about a person in that way, perhaps an image pops to your mind. This person, Paul says, is spiritually dead. Now let's ask a question. What do the spiritually dead need? What do they need? Do they need a blank check? Oh, you're an idolater. Well, good news. Here's a blank check. Revel in it, you know? No. What do they need? They need the gospel. They need the Holy Spirit to break into their heart and convert them. To the spiritually dead who are widows, Paul, I would argue, is going to give a command to preach the word to them in order that they might be saved. And then we'll re-examine the situation. The reason I'm pointing this out is because, generally speaking, there's a lot of handouts that are asked for on a daily basis by a lot of different people. We have to realize that man's greatest need is often spiritual. It's going to do a person not much good at all if you give a little bit here, but you don't really care about their eternal destiny. Paul does. Verses 7 and 8 are a summary. I'm just about done. He's going to give Paul's going to give Timothy a charge. He's going to command him about the proper relationships toward widows within the church. Let's read those verses one more time. Command these things as well so that they may be without reproach. I want you to focus in on verse 7, the word they. Circle that or just kind of underline it in your memory. I'm going to come back to it. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Paul is giving Timothy a command here. Verse 7 includes the word they. My question is, who does that refer to? Based on the immediate context, following verse, I would argue that they refers to the children and grandchildren of widows. To say it differently, there are unbelieving widows, verse 6, and there are unbelieving grandchildren and children, verse 8. if you don't care for your own family, Paul says, and you have denied the faith, you are worse than an unbeliever. Why does he say that? Well, God has hardwired humanity with his moral law. We could call it natural law as well, in which we know, based on this common law that God has given us, that it is right to take care of your parents. And often unbelievers will do the right thing even though they are unbelievers. Paul looks out over the church and he says, friends, if this is the case with an unbeliever, where they will honor their parents, but a believer won't, he says, this is backward thinking. Let me leave you with a question, make one statement, and we'll be done. Does the way that you treat your family communicate that you are a believer? Think about that. Every one of you should ask that question. Children should ask that question. Adults, we should be asking that question. And we should ask it in a broad way. What about our family of the church? Does the way that we treat our church family communicate that we believe in God? The good news, Christian, is that you are never alone in this world. God has given you a family, and if you're in this church, God has given you this family. Family takes care of its own. We are here to spiritually care and physically care for you. Encourage and look out for fellow members of your family. I'm going to pray. Lord God,